Father Bob, thank you for being with us this evening. I know that recently you had an interesting presentation at the Ukrainian Catholic Shrine in Ottawa, and the topic of this presentation, the article itself, was published at Drohobych Seminaria Journal. So, could you please summarize major idea behind doing all that research?
Well, it was basically just a brief history of our church in Canada. So, what I went through was, the first immigrants who came to Montreal and went out to Winnipeg, and then eventually wound up homesteading in Alberta. And what I spoke about was how there have been waves of immigration. Now, there are some groups, for example, the Greeks and the Chinese, that seem to have a continuous immigration. But with our people, it seems to have come in waves. The first one came from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which, of course, folded in 1918. Then there was also an immigration from the short-lived Ukrainian Republic in the 1920s. And then afterwards, Eastern Galicia was occupied by Poland. And so at the end of World War II, of course, we have a political immigration where we have the Nazis coming one way and the Bolsheviks coming the other, and our people get stuck right in the middle of it all. So the Soviet Union winds up taking over Eastern Galicia. So many of our people from that generation, of course, spent time in camps waiting to be accepted as immigrants to places like the United States, Canada, Australia, and so on and so forth. And then the fourth wave came with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the establishment of the Ukrainian Republic. And so we are, getting, some of these people now. Of course, the earliest immigration from Austria, they were farmers. Second immigration were farmers too, but they found that the land was, all the good land was taken up or was very expensive. The third immigration from World War II, from Eastern Galicia, they had many intellectuals and skilled people in that particular generation, and the most recent generation or immigration, they have highly professional people, and they tend to settle pretty much in the largest cities, especially places like Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver. What's interesting to note is that the situation in Ukraine and in Canada at the time of each of these immigrations, it's quite different. Canada changes, and then also it changes for our people, politically, economically. The earliest immigration is from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. They don't seem to have a very strongly developed sense of nationalism. They're building on that. Then you have later on the sense of being Ukrainian is becoming stronger and stronger. Particularly, this is noticeable in the World War II immigration, for whom the preservation of language and culture is extremely important. And then, there's just a big difference living in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, living in Poland, and then living in the Soviet Union, and living in the modern Ukrainian Republic. So there are major cultural differences from one wave of immigration to the next.
So I suppose that study, that understanding of differences in cultural differences, even in those different waves, helps you kind of adjust or think or plan for the pastoral things, for services, language, traditions, all that.
Oh, very, very, very much so. If you take the first immigration, it was economic. These people just wanted to get on with their lives. And when they first arrived, all they spoke was Ukrainian, and they were on the farms, and they were in Western Canada. But like today, the descendants of those first immigrants, they're Canadians, their language is English. Some of them know some Ukrainian. For example, there's a parish, St. George's in Edmonton, where everything is exclusively in Ukrainian. But in Western Canada, for the most part, the working everyday language is English. Sermons are, for the most part, in English, and services are conducted in English. Now, they'll maybe have an English service, and they might sing Sviaty Bože or Micheruvimi or something, but it's basically in English. So in Western Canada, now, of course, there's an outreach too of evangelization, and same thing in Eastern Canada too. For too long, we were actually expressly forbidden by Rome to evangelize outside of our native territories, but Vatican II reversed that. But that idea has not totally caught on. We still have this idea of just taking care of our own people, but as Catholics, we have an obligation to evangelize universally. Eastern Canada, in many ways, is quite different for our church than Western Canada. Eastern Canada, the bulk of our people came with the World War II immigration. And so you had educated people there, skilled people there. And it was a very, very abrupt and traumatic experience for these people to be uprooted just like that. And, to be living in Poland one day and then the next day you're in the Soviet Union. And so for them, the preservation of their own ethnic, national consciousness and language, those are really, really priorities. Western Canada, there are individuals for whom those things are important, but it's not as strongly felt, to the best of my knowledge anyway, as is the case in Eastern Canada. For our church, too, for the Eparchy of Toronto, I think sometimes people don't realize it, that while the overwhelming majority of people are Galician Ukrainians or of Galician ancestry, there never was a time when the eparchy was exclusively Ukrainian, although the Galician character is clearly that of the eparchy. We always had the Hungarians. We did have the Slovaks until they were given their own eparchy. And I don't know if we still do, but we did have the Romanians. So, but the Ukrainians, the Galician Ukrainians, have always clearly been in the majority. But as time goes on, people become more and more Canadianized. In the big cities, though, they do try to preserve language and various aspects of the culture. But of course, we have to always be aware of the fact that we are a church, so the priority always remains the preaching of the gospel. But there are other things that help hold the community together and give people an identity. But our primary identity is as Christians and as Catholics.
So basically, even if we're talking about Eastern Canada, where the question of language and culture is terrifically important, the next generation will still speak more English and French, perhaps, than Ukrainian. But do you feel that identity, those traditions, are still being well preserved, even though the language is not as present as it used to be?
Depends on the parish. Depends on the family. For some families, these things are extremely important. But remember, we have people who are not of Ukrainian ancestry too. So they may have their own ethnic traditions, which are important to them. But for some of them, though, they're just English-speaking Canadians. When these people they come to our church sometimes through marriage, but sometimes through conversion. And when they are converted to our church, it's because they're attracted by the beauty of Eastern liturgy and spirituality. Sometimes they're fascinated by Ukrainian culture and all of that, but then that's not why they come to church. If the Ukrainian church offers an English liturgy, that's where they're going to go. If there's some other Eastern church, if the Ukrainian church did not offer English, and say the Melkite church did from the Middle East, they would probably go to the Melkite church.
So even though the debate continues, and I don't think it's limited to the Ukrainian community in Canada, it's probably, many ethnic communities probably face those issues. But the most important thing from the pastoral perspective, from the church ecclesiastical perspective, is not the language per se. It's, as you say, it's spirituality.
Yes, it's always the gospel is always priority. Because historically, the church has oftentimes helped and protected particular people. You take the Armenians; it's a very national church. Well, there are constantly going back between the Roman and the Persian empires. They were persecuted throughout all of their history. They have a distinct language. They're a very distinct people, very distinct alphabet, and the church is what preserved that, because politically they were constantly being conquered by one side or the other. So these things have developed historically, for certain churches. But this whole idea, of a millet system where each nation, the patriarch is the civil ruler of the people. That's a Middle Eastern thing, and it works in the Middle East because that's nothing else is really available. Once you get to North America, though, the whole social structure and everything is very, very, very different. So all of the Eastern churches. That if they expect to have a future, it's not an either or. It's not, well, if we introduce English, we have to get rid of Ukrainian. No. What you have to do is preach the gospel. Well, if you have some new immigrants from Ukraine who only speak Ukrainian and Russian, well, you reach out to them. If you have people who speak, English and Ukrainian, maybe their English is better, but they grew up with the Ukrainian, well, you don't throw that out. There's a certain amount of, familiarity and an attraction to the religion of your childhood. But then on the other hand, as time goes on, there are places where, all they're interested in is the gospel and English, spirituality and the beautiful liturgy. So I guess in many ways you might say that our church is multicultural.
Like Canada itself. How would you summarize? Did you come to any particular conclusion after presenting that research, publishing that article? Did you have any particular insights, something that struck you from just learning those facts?
The difference from generation to generation, from immigration to immigration, I find significant cultural differences among people who came from Ukraine. But I think what has to happen is, the church has to, I guess, really emphasize the centrality and priority of the gospel. And then in any particular situation, linguistically, you serve the people, you preach the gospel. If you have a parish that's overwhelmingly, new immigrants from Ukraine, you use more Ukrainian. If you have a parish where, people they're just Canadians, they speak English, they might have a smattering of Ukrainian, but they don't understand most sermons, well, you use more English. You cannot lose sight of the fact that you're preaching the gospel. And I think sometimes because we have these other concerns, it's if we're not careful, we can lose sight of what we're supposed to be doing. It's always about Jesus Christ. It's always about passing on the faith. It's always about salvation. It's always about the gospel. And the details might change from this location to that location.